Hello friends, and welcome once again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 1 in our study of Genesis chapter 14. And just a quick reminder for those of you that might be joining us for the first time, all of our previous videos going all the way back to the very beginning are always available at our homepage of a Walk in the Garden Bible study on Facebook. So if you just go to our homepage there, you can access any of the videos at any time and watch them at your convenience. And I'd encourage you to do that just to keep up with our Bible study as we study through the book of Genesis. And so today as we get started, I wanted to remind you that back in chapter 8 and verse 4, according to chapter 8 and verse 4 of Genesis, we know that when Noah and his family was on the ark, and the ark came to rest, we know that it rested, where did it say? It said upon the mountains of Ararat. And so I want to give you a little geographical perspective on where we're at this point in the scriptures. And you know, the mountains of Ararat are literally located in what is modern day Turkey. And Turkey is just north of the big region of Mesopotamia. And ancient Mesopotamia now is under the heading of Iraq. It's at the head of the Persian Gulf. It's got some of the surrounding countries that border it, such as Iran and Kuwait, and Egypt's just down the road. And so you've got all these different modern day and modern era countries there that we're familiar with, that we hear a lot about each and every day. But at this time it was just considered the land of Mesopotamia. And it was in this region, in the region where Iraq, present day Iraq is, that we've been looking at the lives of Abram. But it all started back at the mountains of Ararat, which are just a little bit to the north of Mesopotamia. And that's where the ark had come to rest when Noah and his family first exited the ark for the very first time into the new world, the new, if you want to call it the newly created world after the flood, the new environment now that they were going to exist in because of the global flood that had taken place. And so they dismounted the ark up in those mountains, and then over the course of time, people migrated, and primarily they migrated south. That's where they went to. And they settled in the land of Mesopotamia. And so up until this point, from the time of the flood, was a period of about 400 years. And so, you know, when you think about it, our country, the United States of America, was established basically when the Pilgrims first came over, is really when the first settlements, the first permanent settlements started taking place. And guess what? That was about 400 years ago. So you can see and kind of do a comparison and a parallel to see how much advancement we've had from the very first settlements when the whole entire country was basically unexplored. It was wilderness. It was populated by native tribes, Native American tribes throughout, and, you know, sparsely populated. But now you look, and just over the course of 400 years, well, look at where we're at today. I mean, look at the big cities that we have. Look at the major population centers. Look at the highways, and just the, you know, the civilization and all of the many manifold things that have developed just simply over the course of 400 years, and the population growth for that matter. And so that kind of puts it in perspective that over the course of 400 years, from the time of the global flood to the time that we're studying about here in chapter 14, well, there's been a lot of expansion. There's been a lot of migration. There's been a lot of population growth, and there's been the building of cities. And in fact, it was only 300 years after the flood approximately when the Tower of Babel was built. And we saw what had taken place there in that time. But it's also interesting to note that even in our secular history books, even if you look it up in the encyclopedias, the archaeologists and other scientists and all of the learned men of the day will still attribute the first recorded modern civilization took place in Sumer by the Sumerites, which is in fact in the land of Mesopotamia. So it makes perfect sense. They said the first recorded modern civilization, it took place about 4000 BC And it was right here in the land of Iraq, right here in the land of Mesopotamia, and it just makes perfect, it's in perfect alignment with the scriptures, because that's exactly where the first settlements were taking place. And so we saw that the mountains of Ararat were just north of the region of Mesopotamia, in what is now modern Turkey. And by Genesis chapter 10, the migrations of mankind have made its way south to what the Bible calls the land of Shinar in southern Mesopotamia. And it was here that numerous cities were built, including the city of Babel, and including also the city of Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham hailed from. That's where his family was from, was in the southern or the southeastern part of Mesopotamia. And so that's where this part of human history that we're now studying is taking place. And we know that Abram was from Mesopotamia, and we know that Mesopotamia is a region in Iraq in southwestern Asia. And it is literally located at the end or at the tip of the Persian Gulf, and it is watered by both the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which are still present today. And it forms the eastern area also that you might have heard of is called the Fertile Crescent. And it curves from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea and all the way even over into Egypt. And in this particular time, it was a great center of civilization. And so we know that there were some great things that were going to happen in this area. We know that there was some great, and there was some good fertile land there. You know, the waters there would water the land. They would be used for irrigation, for crops, for their herds. And so it is that we see Abram and Lot, that this is where they were at, and they were in this region, and they were in the region of Canaan. But we know that Mesopotamia was on a long, and in some places a broad, just piece of fertile land. I mean, it was bordered on one side by the mountains of Persia, and on the other side by the desert of Arabia. The line of separation between the fruitful soil and the desert hills was so clear that a man could literally walk in a single step from the black, living earth of the valley to the dry, dead sand of the surrounding slopes. And it was this green strips of Mesopotamia and Egypt where civilization began, somewhere between the approximated time of 4000 to 4500 BC. And so we know that Abram came from Ur, and we know that it was located in southeastern Mesopotamia, and it was actually a place on the Euphrates River and was a flourishing trade city. And so through the centuries, you know, this land had been invaded, had been conquered. And I was reading earlier that I was reading about when the Arab Muslims, and it was actually all the way back to around the 6th century, is when they came in and conquered the area. And of course, that's when you know, most of the religion as a whole turned over to what we now call Islam. And it's been that way ever since. And in fact, today, it's probably around, you know, the population there is probably around 90% Muslim or under the Islamic faith. And so it goes back along, and it's got a long and long history. And you know, the area here was also rebuilt by the Nebuchadnezzar king, or you know, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, around the 6th century BC, and it had been abandoned. But the ruins of this city, the ruins of Ur of the Chaldees, has been recently discovered by archaeologist J.E. Taylor in the year of 1854. So you know, all of these ancient cities can usually be discovered and usually be pinpointed if people refer to the Bible, because the Bible describes where they were at, and usually if they use that as their guide, then eventually they can locate the exact location, and sometimes they can even dig and uncover the actual ruins, the actual foundations of the city itself. And so that's what they do. So there's a lot of history there and a lot of just culture that has been found, and a lot of advanced cultures have been found there, and that's why they have related that it's the first recorded modern civilization. And so we know that in answer to God, the call of God, that Abram left this region and he journeyed to Canaan. And along the way they'd spent some time in Haran, which is in the north, and that was part of their northward travels through the region of the Fertile Crescent. And that was another important trade route. And so we know that another thing that we can observe is that even at these early times, that heathenism and those that had turned away from God and went into false religions had already started and was already taking place. And some of these cities were just saturated by these false religions and by these evil, wicked people that did evil, wicked things before the Lord. And there was many of these communities had shrines even dedicated to the moon god. It was a god that they had decided that was in relevancy and that they wanted to honor and worship. And so they made idols and made statues and dedicated certain shrines and dedicated certain events, religious events, to the worship of this moon god as opposed to the God of creation. And then we know that the descendants of Abram's brother Nahor had actually permanently settled in Haran. And then they journeyed on and eventually landed in the land of Canaan. And as is pointed out, Canaan was occupied collectively by tribes known as Canaanites, and their worship, their religious worships, were directed to an idol and a god that they had developed called Baal. And so Baal worship was prevalent and it was prominent during this period that Abram lived and in this land that he was traveling to. That was the predominant reigning religion at that time in this area. And the worship of Baal included things like the fertility rites, which caused them to be denounced later by spiritual leaders. And this was also the land where Abram would spend time communing with God in the place of Bethel, was in this very heathenistic land that was dedicated to worshiping Baal. And so we were also made aware, I'm just kind of doing a review here, kind of catching us up to where we're at over the past few chapters. And of course we'd noticed that for a while there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and that's where Abram had left and went down to the land of Egypt. And they had stayed there for a period of time. And you know, Egypt is fertilized and irrigated by the annual inundation of the Nile River, and is also supplemented by irrigation. So it could often provide food when Canaan was sparse, when Canaan was suffering, when Canaan was experiencing drought conditions. Oftentimes Egypt was still on the positive side because it was a well-watered area and they had plenty of resources to get them through the dry, sparse times. And so that's where Abram had found himself, him and Lot, for a period to ride out the famine. And then we saw in our last chapter that they had returned to Canaan, and specifically to a place called Hebron. And due to the scarcity of pasture land adequate to provide for both the families and the herds and the flocks, Abram and Lot had chose to separate. And then we saw where Lot had chose the area near Sodom, which was very fertile before they were destroyed. And Abram took the highlands around Hebron, and it was a city particularly associated with in his latter years. And so with all of that said, we're ready to begin our study of chapter 14. And here the Bible says, "And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer And in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuims in Ham, and the Emims in Sanaba Kerethaim, and the Horites in the Mount Seir unto Elparan, which is in the wilderness. And they returned and came to Amishphat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwell in Hazon Tamar. And there they went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zebolim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, the king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, the king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Well, I'm sorry if I butchered up some of those names. I really didn't take time to get them down to a science, but you can read them for yourself and get the pronunciations there. Some of those are a little bit tricky. But the gist of it is that these great mighty nations, these great mighty cities and their kings and their regions, there had been some dissension, and there had been some strife, and there had been some plotting and some planning, and now we see a battle taking place. The very first recorded war between nations is recorded for us right here in this region. And it's rather kind of perplexing that, what do we hear that's going on over there almost continuously is still strife and warrings between the different factions of people that live in this area. They're still warring today. Nothing has changed. Nothing has ended. Nothing has been worked out on a peace process. They all have their own groups. They all have their own countries. They all have their own regions and people's groups, and they all still have conflicts one with another. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this passage of Scripture. And so here that we see, even in this early time of human civilization, that we have a dismal record given. The first recorded account of nations having war together. Now the reason for this is related, is relevant because it's going to eventually affect the lives of Abram and Lot. And isn't that the way that whenever war breaks out, that it will invariably draw in those civilian communities that are in the general vicinity? I mean, it's just bound to happen. If a war's taking place, and there may be some peaceful communities that are trying to stay out of the way, trying to keep a low profile and stay out of the scheme of things, but invariably, if they're in that area, they're going to be impacted by the war in one way or another. And we can even look back in our own country, and we see that during the Civil War times, or even the Revolutionary War. When these things took place, often they carried over into towns, they carried over into cities. Sometimes people had their farms taken over so they could use them for their war machines or use them for their headquarters or whatever. And then oftentimes people were taken prisoner, or the slaves were taken over and they were taken into their own usage, and they were made to do their own biddings and stuff. And so it was just, there was no way to escape it. Because if you're in the region where war is taking place, you are going to get caught up in it one way or another. And so innocent lives are impacted and are affected regardless if they participate or not. It really doesn't matter if they participate, because they're going to, either willingly participate or unwillingly participate in some form or fashion. And so when would this take place? Well, it says it was taking place in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. The invaders were a coalition of forces from 4 kingdoms and their armies. And they would make battle with what? Well, with a coalition of 5 kings and their armies. And they would make battle with Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim and Zoar. Now it's interesting to note that the 5th king that was mentioned here, for whatever reason, is not named, just his kingdom. So we can speculate on that, and we can come up with some plausible reasons why his name wasn't given. But for the sake of this study, we're going to leave that alone. Now first we notice that Amraphel, the king of Shinar. Now Shinar was literally the alluvial plain of Babylonia and included several cities such as Babel, Erech, and Akkad. Then we have Arioch, king of Elasar. And Elasar was the region that took its name from the city of Lasar, which would become the metropolis and head of that area. And it was generally located just off the left bank of the Euphrates River. And then we have Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. Elam was the region just before the Tigris River east of Babylonia. And then we have Tidal, king of nations. So, you know, when they wanted to go to battle, they wanted to make sure they had the support they needed. And they made allies, just as we do today. If we want to go to battle somewhere, well, what do we try to do? We try to take some allies and get some joint coalition of forces, not only to give us a stronger presence, but also to give us support where we're going to need it. You know, maybe we need the airspace to fly our jets through. Maybe we need some land regions that we can take our tanks through or put our ground forces through, or the shipping lanes, or whatever the case is. Well, we want to have some allies that are going to be on our side, or at least support us and let us use some of their resources or some of their lands. Or, and the other side of that is just having a coalition of forces so that we can have a broader or a larger army without having to carry all the brunt of the expense and of the soldiers and the military members ourselves. So we go into it jointly and hopefully share not only the resources, but also share the military might in the form of our soldiers as well. And so here, that's what we see. We see a coalition on both sides. They had gotten together. They had gotten supported by each other. They'd come to an agreement. And they had decided that we're going to invade these lands. We'll split the spoils. We'll share the wealth. And we will take over these lands and we will own them, and then we'll divide them up. We'll divide and conquer. And you know, that's what happens in modern day when you have allied forces that go in and take over some regions. Then sometimes there's a dividing of the lands, there's a dividing of the responsibilities, and there could be a dividing of the resources. But they have to work together if they share the oppression, or not the oppression, but the offensive. Then they also are going to share the spoils. And so that's what we have going on here. And even at this time in human history, oppression was taking place. You know, colonization had been instituted, and communities were subject to the king that was in power. And sometimes these conquering kings that had taken position by force and the communities became their subjects. And such was the case at this point in time. And so what was at the heart of the battle, what was at the heart of the rebellion and the war that's taken place, is the revolt of the 5 kings, because they were revolting and they were protesting the oppression and the kingship under the government of Chedorlaomer. 12 years they had served him. 12 years they were under his thumb. And in the 13th year, they rebelled. You know, they were living in a fruitful land, but they were constantly dominated and controlled by a foreign power. And we've seen that through the decades when colonization takes place. You know, we've seen it maybe in the last century or two, especially, when countries would go in, they would take over these lands from these foreign natives or foreign bodies, and they would colonize them. They would put them under their kingship, under their government, and under their control, and they would just take over the basically the possession of the land, but also the possession of the people. And so the people became subject unto them. And eventually along the way, the people could only stay oppressed for so long before they rebelled. And when the time was right, they're going to rebel. They may not raise up an army, but they're going to raise up something in rebellion and opposition and attempt to regain control of their native land. And in many cases, if their resolve is strong and they've got a coalition of forces, then they will be successful in their endeavors. Well, we're going to keep on studying through this chapter 14 here, and we're going to see the result of this rebellion of these 4 kings against 5, and we're going to see how, as we said, with Abram and especially Lot's proximity and where he's living, he's going to be in the heat of the battle. He's going to be in the heart of the situation. And it's going to have a direct impact and a direct relevancy in their lives. And in fact, in the upcoming verses there, we're going to notice that as a result of this, Lot and his family are actually going to get taken prisoner. And then we're going to see how that's going to have an emphasis and a bearing on Abram and his family as well. And that's where we'll pick it up in our next lesson. So I hope you'll continue and stay with us, and we'll see you then. Thanks.